Good afternoon, and welcome to the Changing Mind podcast, the podcast that looks at how techniques in the psychological and behavioral sciences can be used to tackle problems in everyday life, industry, and society. My name is Matthew Franklin, and I'll be your host today. Today, we're going to be understanding the irrational shopper and the many ways in which consumer behavior, although highly dynamic, can also be highly predictable. We're going to be talking to Sue Benson, who is the founder and managing director of the Behaviors Agency, a creative agency that uses behavioral sciences to make marketing more efficient. Welcome to the podcast, Sue, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to talking to you today.
Excellent, great. Okay, so I guess my first question is, in general, when people start using behavioral science in a new area, they do this thing where they try to tackle what they call low-hanging fruit. So sort of like cost-effective and cheap ways in which they can produce the highest behavioral outcome with the lowest amount of effort to basically prove a point, to prove that behavioral sciences are useful in a particular field. What are some of these low-hanging fruits that you would use in your work when approaching a client initially that might not be informed with behavioral science?
Okay. So we think that all marketing is about influencing behavior, and therefore behavioral science is kind of that fundamental platform that we use. But what we've noticed as we start to talk to marketeers is it's just an incredibly complex subject. And so just sort of managing the myriad of biases and heuristics are really difficult. And we're not behavioral scientists. We are fundamentally marketeers. We work with behavioral scientists. So we needed a way to make the subject simpler so that we could go after the low-hanging fruit and find the ways of doing that. So we created...
That makes sense.
We created a model that focuses on the three factors or influences that need to be in place when you are trying to get somebody to change behavior or influence the behavior. And I'll probably reference those all the way through the session because we fundamentally think about them all the time. So those three interplays are motivation. So somebody actually has to want to do the thing. Then there's a trigger, and that trigger can be a change in their circumstances, or equally from a marketing perspective, that a brand puts something in front of them. And then the final one is the means. So they have to have the money and the time, and it's got to be convenient for them. So all of those three things need to be in place. So when we think about low-hanging fruit, the first thing we ask our client are two questions. How do we increase motivation? So how do we make connections with them, with our brands that really is motivating to them as an audience? And how do we reduce friction? So focus on how we make it easier for them, or evidence point that their brand is faster or has more followers than others. So two simple things. One is increase motivation, and two is reduce friction.
I like it. And I guess it makes a lot of sense for you guys. And it's very interesting to hear how, like, obviously different organizations come up with different models. The Behavioral Insights team has their famous EAST model. And then at UCL, we have the COM-B model. So it's just very interesting to hear how different people tackle it in different ways, because I think there's a lot of knowledge to be gained from understanding these different models and learning how to apply it to different contexts. So I guess for your context, that makes a lot of sense. Sorry.
We've taken those because those of your listeners that understand a little more about behavioural science will know that we've been heavily influenced by the work that BJ Fogg did in terms of habit building. But you're right, we take elements, we take learning from all of the behavioural models. So yours and the EAST framework are sort of built into our thinking, but not necessarily into our framework.
That's really cool. That's very interesting. Okay, so one of these concepts that you often talk about at conferences and on your website is this concept of the irrational shopper. Which is sort of the title of today's episode. So I guess I'm interested in whether you can sort of like introduce this concept a bit more and how this idea of the irrational shopper influences your work at the Behaviors Agency.
Okay, so the irrational shopper, I think, is a little bit about me and my business partner as well. So having spent years and years and years in retail and watching people shop, or equally listening in focus groups and hearing about their shopping experience, you're just blown away often by why some of the most sanest of people buy the things they buy when there's a perfectly better alternative sitting there that's cheaper and it's got more benefits to it, and yet they steadfastly refuse to consider it and crack on that same mode of purchase behavior.
Absolutely.
And it's that autopilot that interests us, and how we interrupt people from default behavior. So because we don't, because as humans, we can't possibly understand all of the decisions or be even conscious of all the decisions we're making all of the time, we go back to the biases, to the mistakes that we've made, and equally the heuristics that we use to make decisions. And I guess for us, the reason that we are interested in the irrational shopper is because that we know that we can use biases and heuristic as levers to be able to influence them and get them to do things. And that's what really excites us. It's taking somebody that's definitely irrational and trying to help them make the more ethical decisions. So we're acutely aware of ethics as well, but it's about being able to shape people's understanding about brand that's really interesting to us.
Absolutely, yeah, that's very interesting, and it makes sense. Sometimes you have to use people's irrationalities to make them more rational. It's not always about using rationality to make people more rational.
Absolutely, and emotion is so heavily at play here as well. So.
Yeah. If anything, it's probably one of the greatest insights from the psychological sciences for sure. And so what's an example of when you've been an irrational shopper recently, and what do you think these moments reveal about us, as people?
Well, mine is a bit of an extreme example, but it's probably quite an important example. So a couple of years ago, I was looking for a new car, and I decided that it absolutely 100% needed to be electric. I wanted to move to electric, and I wanted to save money on my monthly payment. So two very, very rational motivations, very much based on security, saving money and all of those things, saving the environment. And I went through 4 or 5 months of choosing the perfect electric car. And then one day, my husband had a car. He brought a car home from the garage where his car was being serviced, and it was a little red Jaguar. And on the Saturday, I bought a little red Jaguar. It wasn't electric, and it certainly didn't save me any money. And so I think what it says about us is that we are easily influenced, and we just need to understand the motivations of our consumers. So clearly at that stage, I wasn't driven by security or belonging. I was very much driven by status, although I probably wouldn't have wanted to admit that to myself at the time. But that emotional connection I had with that little red car, still with me today. In fact, it's due to go back, and I'm going through the same process at the moment of, yes, I'm definitely going to have electric, and yes, I'm definitely going to have money. So we'll see in December what I actually do.
But it's good. I don't know. I guess the way you've answered this question is sort of like, I could definitely tell that, you going with your rationality put a smile in your face. And I think that definitely says that sometimes we need to let people to fully be irrational shoppers. And that it's sort of highly important. And it's these moments that are very authentic to people and memorable.
And it's hugely important to retailers as well, and particularly at the moment with retailers, and in physical spaces much more so, because we need people to have that kind of smile on the face by finding a perfect product, which is definitely emotional.
Absolutely. Okay, so now I'd like to sort of switch back to more some of the stuff that you do with the Behaviors Agency. So you guys are obviously famous for your work on branding, and you've worked with a lot of clients in branding. So what is sort of like the behavioral science behind branding? What makes for a good brand from a behavioral perspective? What are some of the new insights that you bring to the table?
Yeah, so we approach it the same way, actually. We think about branding in much the same way. So we use the same model to inform our thinking, because for us, branding is, and really effective and powerful branding is rooted in that understanding of consumer behavior, albeit we might look at it in a slightly different way. So for us, really powerful brands are rooted in truly motivating propositions to their audience. They really understand their audience, and they're really delivering a benefit to them. Then the second is, rather than thinking about triggers as an action, think about them as a heuristic. So think about the world's biggest and most successful brands. You'll think about the color of them, or the sound of them, or the iconography, or the tone of voice. So those heuristics act as triggers. So truly motivating, incredibly powerful heuristics. And then finally, they're always the ones that make it really, really easy to shop for them. They're always the ones that make it really, really easy to shop for them. So if you think of a Waitrose, for example, they're incredibly motivating from a product viewpoint. They've made it very easy for you to buy and access them, particularly now that they've moved to their own platform, and their branding's very much based on their partners. So they've got a really clear identity in comparison to the other people in the market. You know, likewise, you think of the color red and what brand comes to mind. I'll give you a hint, Coke.
Yeah, of course.
Then you've got the
It immediately came to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got UPS Brown. So actually it's being top of mind. So those brands that combine motivation, making it really, really easy to buy and have a performance-led philosophy, and those powerful heuristics, definitely what makes a good brand.
I found it quite interesting that you said that you base the brand in what existing customers already want. So it's like really playing to their strengths rather than trying to change it in some radical way to get potentially new buyers in. But it's sort of like starting with your base and then sort of expanding from that rather than trying to like move too much, which is interesting. That is obviously evidence-based for sure.
And we spend a lot of time really understanding the default and working out how we need to move people away from that default. And the further we have to move people from that default, the harder it is. So I can come on and talk about a little bit about that in terms of flow and introducing friction later on.
Excellent, great. Okay, so yeah, and another thing that you guys are obviously famous for is that you design user experiences. And on your website, you mentioned that one of your favorite user experiences is the one that consumers can experience on ASOS. So what is the behavioral science of the ASOS customer experience, and what does this reveal about what other companies can learn about in order to provide this sort of behaviorally informed user experience?
Yeah. So if you go back to so what we talked about earlier, so again, the motivation, the trigger, and the means, what I think ASOS has done is really focused on trigger and means. So by means, what they've done is made their whole shopping experience frictionless. So they really picked up when they launched on our desire, particularly millennials' desire, for instant gratification. They wanted something today, or if not tomorrow. That was probably the time frame. So they introduced just simple mechanics like ASOS Prime for $9.99, which gets people the outfit they want for when they go out to the club tomorrow night. And that very simple, removing the friction, so they made it almost as easy as going to the shops, is one way of looking at it. And it's really funny in lockdown, it's one of the things for us anyway that we really noticed as a team. The instant gratification sort of shifted outwards, and you were really surprised at having to wait for things. It felt really uncomfortable. So when ASOS did it, so they reduced the friction in terms of time of delivery. They then reduced the friction in terms of payment. So they were one of the earliest adopters of Klarna in the UK. And Klarna allows you to buy a load of clothes and spread that over a period of time. So again, they've reduced the friction around payment. And obviously what they are as well are extremely quick to market. So they're quick to pick up on the trend. So as soon as we went into lockdown and all hit our pajamas, lo and behold, pajamas were on every email that they sent to you. And so loungewear is now a fundamental category. So it's their speed of response to market that I think they've built their customer experience around. And then they have all the benefit from a triggers approach. So if you think about being in people's inbox on an almost daily basis, or on a notification on your phone, they're constantly giving you those little reasons to buy. And they're incredibly relevant around time of day, or what the weather's doing, or what they've just seen. It's that moment of relevance. So they've really leveraged those two things from a means and a triggers perspective.
Yeah, it seems like very, very tailored as a result.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, very interesting to know what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so that's obviously a very sort of like online example, but you guys obviously also work with retailers that have, physical stores. So what's sort of going on there? What's some of the behavioral science that you might use with a retailer, for instance, that doesn't have the advantage of, maybe quickly changing a shop front as quickly as, the time it takes to change an interface, I guess, is much faster than to change a shop front. So what do they do in order to respond to customer needs?
There's a range of things that that they can do. So we quite often talk to clients about hot state decision making. So we've got some clients that operate in the sports retailing world, and so we talk about things like smells and acting in the moment, so trying to recreate those moments. So if you're a gym brand, for example, and you're trying to sell merchandise, actually that whole experience is amplified by sweat and things like that. So we try and put retailing into gym environments so that the kind of concept and the connections are much closer. So, but equally, some of the same principles are at play. You're trying to remove friction through the shopping process. And strong space planners will do that for you. So you're trying to get the path to least resistance. That's always what we're trying to do. And thinking about interruptions, so interventions that actually cause people to stop and think about reviewing products or looking at new products. So they're almost the same principles. It's just that the dynamics are much harder to control.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's about, I guess the main takeaway for me, at least, was that you're trying to create sort of this moment that feels very real. Yeah. So would you say that that's the main difference between sort of like e-commerce and retail, or are there any other sort of like really obvious things that one needs to consider?
Well, the obvious thing is physicality. You can touch things. So we work in the DIY category or the home improvement category, and a big part of what we do there is try and get people to touch and feel products, and that, you know, that's fundamentally the difference between online. And so what we do is almost the more that people engage with the products, and it's from a personal investment. So it comes from the commitment biases. So that personal investment with the product. So the more you get them to touch, the more you get them to feel, the more you get them to try on, the more engaged with the product they are, the more likely they are to buy. So a lot of the work that we do is to create that physical connection with things.
Absolutely, yeah. That is sort of like radically different from what you're trying to go for from an e-commerce experience. Because with e-commerce, you want to really show that people have choice and that it's tailored. And if anything, you want to give them sort of more options. While here, you want sort of more engagement with a less amount of options.
That's right.
In a very sort of tactile way. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, yeah, that is radically different. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I've noticed online that you guys are very open about some of the core principles that you use in your approach. And, you know, I've looked through them, and I actually have a couple of questions for two sort of quite like crucial ones that you use in your approach to marketing. So one core principle says that people buy what they know. Yeah. And, you know, I absolutely agree with that. It's very sort of like intuitive and normal for people to try to, you know, buy the things they know, because it's I guess it's easy. It saves people time. You don't need to overthink things. But then that obviously raised the question of, how do new companies in a category stand the chance of competing with already existing ones if people ultimately want to buy what is familiar? You know, how can new companies present themselves in a sort of familiar way while also reassuring their potential customers that they are new and better?
Okay. And it's about understanding familiarity. So, and the extent of the importance of familiarity. So we use a couple of techniques there. So we either look at the semiotics of a category to unearth some of the codes and the signals of the environment and understand what's crucial in that area. Or equally, if money is not going to stretch that far from a client budget viewpoint, we use very simple observational research to understand the rules. So we'll create kind of the 10 rules of the familiar. And what you take from there, what you start to look at there is what's important from a flow viewpoint. So, so which things do you need to remain familiar with, and which things do you need to disrupt? So, because what we found is that breakages cause people to reevaluate a category. So you might go into gardening, for example, and the whole of gardening, when you look in the category, is green. And you think, well, actually, I could break that, because if I go in and be blue in a category, I'm suddenly different. But actually what you find out when you start to analyze the color green and what that adds to the category is that it's about freshness and growth, and therefore blue, which is not, and it's more associated with other things, that's not necessarily something that you'd want to break. So we look, as I said, we look at the flow to see what we can be familiar with, so that we've got the presence and we match and we don't interrupt people's brains in a way that will freak them out, or we go to breakages. And if you think just as a simple thing, because you can look at this in terms of the way products are designed, the way that you go to market with your brand, or equally your branding, all of those things can be levers that you pull. If you think of a really simple example of this, Uber. So we were all really, really familiar with taking a taxi, and we understood taking a taxi, albeit we were annoyed by ringing the taxi company, waiting for the 10 minutes for it to come, ringing them and saying it's not coming, all of those things. They took the common concept of the familiar of the taxi and added a completely unique new experience. And so they took concept that was familiar and broke, in effect, the route to market, and they've become incredibly successful on the back of that. So it's just
excellent. Yes, it's almost sort of like you don't always have to change the product. Sometimes changing the presentation and the experience of the product is enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay. And yeah, another one of these core principles that you use at the Behaviors Agency is that people buy what makes sense in the context.
Yeah.
So could you please talk about some of these sort of contextual factors that you consider in your work, and, you know, maybe a bit about, you know, how do you sort of measure these things to make sure that they're changed in a sort of systematic way?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so we believe that all decisions are made comparatively or relatively. We don't make decisions without comparing it against something. So we have a model that enables us to think about the comparison sets. And what sits behind them are a whole range of biases that we access and we can play with. And the contextual influences are sixfold, and they make up the word metric. So apologies that I will spell metric out.
Go for it.
So the first one's money. So so one of the comparisons that people make is around value perception. So there's a whole load of biases at play there, and we analyse both brands and consumers on that spectrum. So we understand what they're talking about in terms of value. How do they determine the value of their product? What's the sales strategy that sits behind it? How do they use biases like power of free, for example? So there's a whole range of things that we do around money. Then people also use effort. So again, this is around that path to least resistance. So how much effort and thought is required to buy a product. So if you take buying a can of beans versus buying a bedroom, for example, there's an enormous amount of difference in terms of the effort that's required.
Yeah.
And how do we make it easier for people to go through those processes? So that's the E. Then T is about time, and time's a really interesting dimension, and the ASOS experience that we talked about earlier is a good example of that. It's instant gratification and immediacy. And so there's lots of biases that sit behind that to help us understand things like pensions. So we constantly want to put off the future. We don't want to be making money now because we're not going to get it for years. Well, some of us like me will be getting it sooner than others, but we're not going to get it for years. So it's understanding that time dimension and when a product fits into lifestyle. So that's quite important. Then we look at risk. So we're really risk adverse naturally. So how do we maintain the status quo? How do we avoid loss aversion or leverage loss aversion, either way? So that's risk. Then we have individuality, and that's the extent to which we follow the herd. So lots of brands have built their models around that. So TripAdvisor is a great example, and you can see that's why Trustpilot lives on just about everybody's homepage now, because we security of it's less about individuality there, and it's more about the security of going with the herd. And then the final that makes up metric is conscious thought, and this is all about the autopilot decision. So how do you interrupt that autopilot? And there's some lovely biases that sit behind that, like the von Restoff effect, which is all about interruption and creating differences. And Cadbury's gorilla ad is a brilliant example of that being used, because who'd have thought a gorilla playing the drums would ever be used to sell hundreds of thousands of Cadbury's milk bars? So
yeah, absolutely never.
We look from a measurement viewpoint, we take each one of those and we have a model that sits behind them to look at a weighting to see which one we should test first. So there's a bit of tech and that sits behind that to give us that platform to be able to work out what's the testing order. And you know, we try and isolate some of those, but equally some of them work together.
Excellent, fascinating. And yeah, you can really tell that, like, sort of from that framework, there's just sort of like tens and tens of years of psychological research, you know, dating back from, you know, the Kahneman stuff in the 70s of loss aversion and risk aversion. So yeah, that's really, really interesting. You can really tell that you're fans of psychology just alone by like covering that metric. That's really cool. Okay, great. So I guess my final question for today is about, you know, psychology ultimately and psychological theory. So it says here that, you know, you've mentioned in a lot of talks and in a lot of articles that one of your favorite psychological theories is this one called the commitment pledge. So, you know, what is the commitment pledge, and why do you like this theory so much? And what does it allow you to do in your professional and personal life?
Oh, I honestly, I absolutely love it. I love it because it's easy to understand, which, let me tell you, in behavioural science is always helpful. But that's not the real reason. The commitment pledge, it sort of roots itself back to the consistency bias. So it works on the principle that once you've said something out loud to a group of people, you are more likely to deliver upon it. So if you take it from a personal level, so you commit to running a 5K on Facebook, once you've put it on there, you're more likely to do that, as opposed to when I just say to my daughter, I'm going to do 5K, and you never do it. So it's that wanting to be consistent with our own point of view. So I love it from a personal perspective. So once you commit to something, you actually feel forced into or encouraged into doing it. But actually, I love it from a professional viewpoint because it kind of appeals to my love of brands that have core purpose at their heart. So brands like Patagonia and Tom's, who have made an absolute commitment to a cause, and they run their business models against it. So it really helps people to focus on their vision, where they're going and how you get to it. And I think there's a lot in there. So for example, in our business, we're a people-focused business, and our vision is around being the happiest little agency in the world. And so we take that happiness and we've created a happiness pledge, which I'll have to read because this is terrible. I can't remember it off the top of my head. We pledge to make every day. Go for it. We pledge to make every day a happy day at work, and it drives absolutely everything. So in all of our decisions, we made sure we're building kindness into it and purposefulness into it and resilience and engagement. And it just focuses the entire business on how we want to operate, because we've said that this is our pledge and this is what we're delivering against, and it gets held up against you. So actually, I think it really helps with all of the motivations and issues we have in not being able to deliver some of our, I guess, ambitions.
That's excellent. Yeah, and you can really sort of tell when you gave some of these examples that, you know, a brand like Patagonia, when you sort of engage with it, has such a sense of like clarity to a point where you could almost predict what their next move is going to be, because they can predict what their next move is going to be. Exactly. So I guess in a way, commitment makes brands more transparent also, which I'm sure people like.
Exactly.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us at the Changing Mind podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I definitely learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to releasing this so that people can learn too. Where can people find you if they want to, you know, follow you online and follow your work? You know, Twitter, LinkedIn, what are good places?
So you'll find us at www.thebehaviorsagency.com, or on LinkedIn. We're prevalent with buckets loads of content there, so that's probably the best two places. We're obviously on Twitter and Facebook and Insta, but I'd go to www.thebehaviorsagency.com and you'll find everything you need there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sue.
All right, no problems.